Today, I'm going to tell you about a man who built a 5-bedroom house in Kenya. The man went ahead and supported different wildlife conservancies in Kenya. He funded schools in Lamu, and because of how he had fallen in love with Kenya, he obtained a Kenyan resident permit. But wait for it. He was then declared a non-resident by a local tax committee. This wasn't done by a stranger. It was done by a committee that had been provided even with photographs of this man's home. But the committee either decided not to look at those photographs or they ignored those photographs entirely. The important thing is that the question of whether you are a Kenyan resident, for tax purposes in this case, or not, is not a very simple matter. Because the answer to that question determines which country has the right to tax certain amounts of your income. It also affects the amount of withholding tax that is calculated on, let's say, the loans and transactions that involve your Kenyan entities. And mind you, this can be a very big difference between a significant tax liability or none at all. If you are there and you are a Kenyan national with a property in Kenya, or you are a Kenyan with complex cross-border tax arrangement, this case carries a substantial lesson for you that you cannot afford to miss. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how Kenyan law defines residence for you as an individual and why this really matters. Because the number of days you spend in Kenya is not always the deciding factor. On this video, I'm also going to explain the double taxation treaty between Kenya and Norway and what it says about residents and why the courts in Kenya found it was very, very irrelevant, not relevant, very irrelevant in this case. And for that, let's get taxing. Halvor Astrup was a very wealthy Norwegian philanthropist who fell deeply in love with Kenya. And like every other Mzungu with nice taste, you would definitely fall in love with Kenya. So what he went ahead and did, he acquired Enasoit Ranch in Laikipia. Once he acquired it, he tore it down, removed all the old structures, and he built himself a proper home, a 5-bedroom house. He then put a pool there for his guests. He put several other permanent cottages and conference center. Then he did everything, the whole 5 yards. Because to him, he was not just a tourist who is trying to build a safari lodge. He held a Kenyan resident permit. He also held his own alien card, and he truly felt he had a genuine connection with Kenya as a country. That's why in the beginning I said he supported conservancies, he funded schools, and he contributed towards different charitable cases all across Kenya. Whenever Astrup visited Kenya, he used to stay in that 5-bedroom house because that was his preferred cottage. And he used to bring his friends around, and you have to hear this, at his own expense. Now, sadly, Halvor passed away. And when he did, KRA, as a very good vulture, came calling. KRA came to the ranch with a specific tax question. Halvor had advanced different loans to the ranch through his companies that had been registered in the British Virgin Islands. Under Kenyan law, when a loan comes from an unregistered resident who controls the borrowing company must pay withholding tax on the deemed interest. This deemed interest, the law assumes, is being charged even if it's not being explicitly stated in any agreement. The commissioner said Halvor was Norwegian, not Kenyan, and therefore he was a non-resident. And because of this, he needed to pay the withholding tax. And here, the ranch disagreed. And the ranch disagreed because, as I told you before, Halvor had a permanent home in Kenya, the 5-bedroom house, and he even had built several permanent cottages in Kenya. The Kenyan tax law, an individual who has a permanent establishment in Kenya and was present in Kenya for any period during that year of income, that person is considered a resident. But when this evidence was presented to KRA, KRA didn't budge. And that's why this dispute went to a local tax committee. And this committee made a decision that would later be described as something inexplainable. This local committee went ahead, reviewed the documents provided, but it said there was no evidence of a permanent home for Halvor. The committee claimed that Halvor had no permanent structure locally. They even said there is no temporary structure that was presented to them, and even a single room doesn't exist that was permanently built and belonged to Halvor. And based on this finding from the committee, they declared him an unresident under the Kenya-Norway Double Taxation Treaty, and in this instance, the ranch lost the case. But here's the problem. The ranch had submitted actual photographs to the committee. These were clear, they were in color, and they were the photographs of that 5-bedroom house. Remember the one I told you about? So either the committee had lost the photos or simply they did not have a chance to look at them. And the official record of the committee proceedings, which you can get the transcript of, had actually vanished entirely, and no one could find the transcript for that committee. And here is when the case gets interesting. The ranch was very clear. They knew they had provided the photos. That is why the ranch appealed to the High Court and asked the judge to look at the photographs that they had presented together with additional evidence. But before I tell you what the judge decided, if you need any taxation support, please go ahead and send us a message. Back to the judge. Justice Kasango agreed to consider the evidence. And when she looked at the evidence, that evidence changed everything. The photographs were there and they showed real permanent buildings, not temporary ones, permanent ones. The ranch chairman saw an affidavit explaining that Halvor had built that main 5-bedroom house as his home in Kenya and that he always stayed in the same cottage. Whenever he visited Kenya, that was his home. The chairman also pointed that the invoices the commissioner was pointing to, and these were the invoices that the commissioner was using to suggest that the cottages were for paying guests, these invoices were actually what Halvor paid for friends who came to visit at his invitation, and he's personally the one who was paying for the friends who came to visit. They were not his expenses, but these were expenses for friends who came to visit him. Justice Kasango was very, very clear in her judgment because he could see there was a disconnect here. And I said Kasango, not Kasongo. I said Kasongo. Anyway, the judge said that the local committee was entirely wrong. Under the Kenya Income Tax Act, a resident includes any individual who has a permanent establishment in Kenya and someone who was present for any period during that tax year. Halvor fit the description to a T. He had a permanent home in Kenya. Additionally, he had been present in Kenya for the year in question. And for this, the number of days spent in Kenya were irrelevant. They could have been relevant if he did not have a resident permit. So all that was required for him was to have been in Kenya for any number of days. According to the judge, the committee's finding that no permanent structure existed directly contradicted the photographic evidence that the committee had either lost or had ignored entirely. Now, it came to the question of the double tax treaty that Kenya has with Norway. This is the treaty that the committee had relied on to declare Halvor an unresident person. Justice Kasango found it very irrelevant. Kenya's domestic law defined residence very clear and in no uncertain terms. And that definition placed Halvor family within Kenya's tax jurisdiction. And that definition placed Halvor family within Kenya's tax jurisdiction and placed him family within Kenya's tax jurisdiction as a resident. The committee decision had to be set aside. The ranch did not have to pay any of the withholding tax that KRA was asking for. And to sweeten the matter, KRA was ordered to pay for the cost of the appeal. And here's the lesson. If you are a foreign national with a home in Kenya, whether it is a house you build, a cottage you use regularly, or a property you maintain, and you maintain this as a base when you are in the country, you may be a Kenyan resident for tax purposes. And this is regardless of your nationality and also regardless of the number of days you are spending in Kenya. The test under the Income Tax Act is whether you have a permanent home in Kenya and whether you are present here in Kenya at any point during that specific year of income. That's the first lesson. The second lesson is about evidence and preservation of the same. The ranch had provided photographic evidence that would have won the case if the committee had reviewed those photographs at the committee level. Those photographs were either lost or, as I said, ignored. And the transcript of the proceedings had disappeared as well. So there is no way we could have known whether the photographs were there or not. And as a result, the ranch had to fight all the way to the High Court so that that photographic evidence can be considered. So always be very keen and keep the copies of everything you submit to the tribunal or anything you provide to the committee, and always request a written record or the exact proceedings so that you have your own copy of what was presented to either of those bodies. The third lesson is about double taxation treaties. These are very, very powerful, but they are not necessarily your first port of call. The Kenya domestic law applies first. And if domestic law already resolves the questions that you may have with KRA, then the double taxation treaties may not need to be consulted at all. So if you're there and you're a foreigner, do not assume that a treaty automatically overrides the local definition of tax. If you're there, you're a foreign national with a property and any other economic interest in Kenya, or if you're managing a Kenyan entity that has received loans from non-resident shareholders or loans from related parties, reach out to us so that we can understand your specific withholding tax obligations. And we'll also look at your residency position. Reach out to us to understand your withholding tax obligations and your residence position. In the next video, I'm going to tell you about a construction company whose director in Nairobi received a personal tax assessment of over 10 million for withdrawals he had made from his own company, a full 10 million. Now, this director fought all the way to the High Court and won. And they won by using one thing. And that's the thing that I'm going to tell you in this next video. So, see you there.